Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our Trade Policy Research Forum webinar on carbon border adjustment mechanisms. It's a very timely topic, it's a very important topic, and we're really lucky to have a couple of great experts with us today who've done some recent work, both from a legal perspective and an economic perspective on CBAMs. Before we get started, and while people are just coming into the room, let me say a few words about the Trade Policy Research Forum. If you're joining us for the first time, then welcome. We're very happy to have you with us. We've been established now for a little over 3 years. We're an online forum and a purely volunteer-run organization. Our objective is to try and bridge the gap between good research and good policy making in trade. So we try to bring together people from all different parts of the trade policy community, economists, lawyers, public policy professionals, practitioners, and we try to get them to talk to each other around one or two pieces of research. So we have roughly monthly webinars. In most cases, we're talking about a research paper or two research papers that our presenters have written. In other cases, we do things like talk about careers in trade policy, how people got started, how they got where they are. And we talk about emerging policy issues in more of a kind of a forum setting. So we mix up all of these different types of presentation over the year. You can see from our logo that bridging the gap is something we're very attached to, not only between research and policy, but also between the global centres of trade policy like Geneva, Brussels, and Washington, DC, and people in particular in low and middle income countries who don't always have access to high quality research presentations on trade policy. So that's something that we're trying to do. Again, welcome to everyone who's joining us today, and a special welcome if you're joining us for the first time. Please check out our website at tprforum.org. You can find links to all of our past webinars. You can find a sign-up link for our mailing list, which is the best way that we have of letting you know what we've got going on and what's coming down the pike. And of course, please check out our LinkedIn group. We have about 3,000 trade specialists and professionals linked up there, and it's a great place to post a research paper, get some comments, see job announcements, and all that kind of thing. So that's it on the forum. Let me hand over to my partner in crime and co-founder, Hannah Norberg, to introduce our speakers.
Hey, Ben, thank you so much for handing that over, and thank you for making the introduction. Welcome, 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 everybody, and specifically Amar Breckenridge, who is from Frontier Economics in Switzerland, and Stuti Toshi, who is coming in from Waterhouse Cooper in Waterhouse is what it's called, right? Just Waterhouse. 2 words now, in India. We are just thrilled to have you, and we're thrilled to have so many people coming in here. As a couple of you already, let's see. So I'm coming in from Sweden. Ben is in New York. Please jump right into the chat box and let us know where you guys are coming in from. You know that this is an interactive webinar by now. And so we want to have those conversations flowing all the way from the beginning because we always run out of time. And speaking of which, without further ado, I will hand it over to you, Stuti.
Just before we hand it over, let me remind people that our 2 participants today have been good enough to come along and talk to us about their research, but they're speaking in a strictly personal capacity. So no one is engaging their organisation or any organisation or government or other body that they're associated with. It's a purely personal presentation. With that, sorry, the floor's back to you, Stuti.
Thank you, Van. No worries. And thanks for the disclaimer, quite a relevant one. With that, I'm happy to start with the presentation. For bandwidth reasons, I'll be switching off the camera. 1 second. If someone could just confirm if my screen's visible.
Yes, it is.
Great. Thanks, Ben. So, good morning, evening, or afternoon, everyone, based on wherever you are situated today. It is an absolute pleasure to be here today amongst such a distinguished panel with Ben, Hannah, and even Mr. Amar. I'm Stuti Toshi, an international trade and investment lawyer, and today I'll be speaking in strictly personal capacity. Firstly, let me congratulate Ben and Hannah for organizing this webinar and essentially initiating this discussion on such a crucial topic today, carbon border adjustment mechanism. In the first 15 minutes of this webinar, I'll be taking you through three aspects of CBAM. Firstly, what it is. Secondly, what are its legal implications vis-a-vis WTO law? And thirdly, what are the developing country or LDC implications that it brings to the table? The bottom line is clear, right? Environmental concerns are very real, and it is imperative on all of us to address them. Question is, how do we address them? The models play an important role here. The idea, I think, is to address climate change in such a way that does not disregard international commitments and does not artificially put some countries at a relative disadvantage. The models designed by countries in addressing climate change need to be cognizant of these disclaimers. Firstly, let's talk about its design. So, carbon border adjustment mechanism, as the name suggests, is a border adjustment that is imposed on the imports entering into the European Union. Essentially, companies are driven by money. So, putting a price on carbon emissions should start companies to stop polluting. This is what carbon markets have been designed for, to reduce emissions by charging polluters. In historically analyzing the context, in 1980s America, the power plant emission concern was very real. So, in 1990, an experiment was launched by the American government, passing a law forcing the polluters to pay for their emissions by establishing a new type of market governed by a system called as cap and trade. 8 years later, Eastern America faced reduced acid rain levels over large regions by 20%, and a new way of cutting emissions was seen. In 1997, the International Climate Change Treaty, Kyoto Protocol, suggested applying the cap and trade to carbon. Eventually, countries started establishing their own carbon markets, many employing cap and trade. Now, what is cap and trade? Basically, governments set a cap on CO2 that can be emitted by an industry. It splits the cap into permits and either gives or sells these permits to different countries. If a company doesn't use all of its allowance, it can sell what it doesn't need. If a company needs more, it can buy from those with spares. Each year, the cap gets stricter and the shrinking pool of permits gets more expensive. Overall, this creates a race for decarbonization. However, effectuating it can get challenging, especially when companies start shifting their emissions abroad where lax regulations prevail or lesser or no penalty for emissions exist. This is what is called as carbon leakage, essentially, where carbon tax avoidance due to relocation takes place. Now, to avoid leakage, it would help if the carbon tax systems around the world were more integrated. However, as that's not the case today, or at least in the short run, hence it appears that EU's CBAM is designed as a way to address leakage in that short run.
Stuti, sorry to interrupt, but we're just noticing that your slides are not advancing. I'm not sure if there's something's stuck there.
The idea is to stick to the slide, Ben, for now,
okay.
because now yeah?
Perfect, thanks.
No worries. In July 2021, now coming to the actual context of how CBAM came into picture, in July 2021, European Union released the proposal for a regulation on carbon border adjustment mechanism. Eventually, in May 2023, the proposal was effectuated as a regulation. This is a part of the Fit for 55 European Green Deal package. Starting 2026, it will impose a levy on specific carbon-intensive sectors, including iron and steel, aluminium, fertilizers, cement, electricity, from countries with lower environmental standards as compared to EU. This mechanism has been effectuated starting October 2023 with the transitional phase lasting up to December 2025. Now, during the initial transitional phase, which is starting October 2023 till December 25, only reporting requirements have been prescribed. It's important to note that the obligation to report here includes both direct and indirect emissions. However, starting 2026, importers will have to start purchasing CBAM certificates to cover for their direct carbon emissions at prices corresponding to EU's current carbon price. It's not yet clear as to whether indirect emissions will be included at a later stage after the transitional period is over or not. Now, essentially, the Fit for 55 package has a central theme that is, carbon emissions should have a price. The CBAM complements it by aligning carbon price on imports with that applicable within the EU. In terms of scope, it covers imports from all non EU countries unless either a country participates in the ETS, which EU ETS, which at this stage includes Iceland, Liechtenstein, and Norway, or if a country has linked their carbon markets to the EU ETS, which includes Switzerland. Certain territories have also been carved out outside the CBAM regulation as of now. The overall implication appears to be to get other countries to start levying tax on carbon. Otherwise, either EU's charge would apply, or if there is a similar tax or charge, the difference would still remain payable to the EU. Additionally, for the tax paid in other jurisdictions to be recognized by EU, there has to be a concluded agreement to that effect, which fully links EU ETS with that country's ETS. Plus, the tax as charged in EU has to be effectively charged without any rebates beyond those applied in the EU. This is a very high threshold for other countries to meet for their carbon taxes to be recognized by EU, is how at least the developing countries could foresee this. Now, without delving much into procedure, one important point to note about CBAM as of now is that quarterly CBAM reports are to be submitted by the EU importers. As per the guidance document that the EU has released, it's indicated that operators outside EU have to report on an annual basis. However, this might not be practicable as for the importers to procure this information, the information has to be provided by the operators. For them to be able to successfully report every quarter, operators would have to, supplement providing this information every quarter. Secondly, while information about actual emissions to be reported would be preferred with reliance placed on verification, however, during the transitional period, verification requirement has been waived off. Further, if actuals are not available, then EU has given this option of reporting vis-a-vis default values to calculate embedded emissions. In December 2023, the default values have been published by EU. It's also specified that these default values can only be relied up to second quarter of 2024, beyond which using default values would qualify as estimation. Further, it's also expected that EU will be updating the default values. While it was initially indicated that average emission intensity of a country-based default would be notified, however, currently the default values which are notified are not country-specific. The regulation makes it clear, though, that the determination of default values is based on X% worst performing EU ETS installations. This penalization is also not sufficiently clarified, is how we see it. Now, this graph depicts the movement of carbon prices in the EU, essentially the prices of EU carbon permits. And as it stands today, it's at 65.42 euros. There are studies which say that it has to range between $50 to $100 for the carbon price to be effectively navigating through the carbon emission reduction commitments that it's thought to be claiming. Now, coming on to the legal side of this and the potential WTO compatibility issues that CBAM presents. Firstly, let's look at Article 1 and 3 of GATT. On a general note, under WTO law, all member states are obligated to ensure compliance with the provisions of the covered agreements. One of the potentially hit covered agreement could be the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or GATT. Article 1 and 3 of GATT embody non-discrimination obligations between like products from different countries and vis-a-vis like products versus imported products. Products from different installations and eventually from different countries could be taxed differently based on the differences in emissions as cited by the operator in question. This is because, depending on emissions, the valuation of carbon levy would be determined, which will differ for different operators. Here, as the embedded carbon emission within a product would be an assessment of non-product related production and process method. In WTO parlance, this is referred to as NPR PPMs. Its impact on the likeness test of products when being compared for checking discrimination would be limited, is what I think. Based on the WTO jurisprudence assessment, it appears that this question hasn't been answered sufficiently. So, if this is adjudicated upon in the future, the panels might have a specific view. However, appellate bodies' past practice has indicated that different NPR PPMs generally do not render products like. Hence, in the process of establishing discrimination under Article 1 and 3, embedded carbon based product distinction could be potentially expected to not affect likeness unless a decision in the future goes otherwise. Here, the very fact that different values of taxes would apply to products from different countries could establish discrimination. Now, moving on to Article 22A of GATT. Under this article, the principle enshrined is to ensure that border taxes can be imposed whereby the charge applied on the import is equivalent to an internal tax. Here, the threshold is that the charge imposed on the imported product has to be equivalent with the internal tax on a like domestic product or in respect of an article from which the imported product has been manufactured or produced. A factual point to note is that the price of CBAM certificate would be determined by the weekly average price of EU ETS allowance sold. Now, these EU ETS allowances are financial instruments which are traded since 2018. So, market factors of demand and supply play a role in their valuation. So, the assessment under Article 22A comes down to three questions. Firstly, is the EU ETS allowance price the determinant of relevant internal tax for this calculation? Secondly, because EU ETS price is not directly a tax on internally circulated product, so the fact that carbon is being taxed in both cases, that is EU ETS and CBAM, could that play a role, especially in assessing whether taxing carbon could be whether it could be qualified as an article from which the imported product has been manufactured or produced in whole or in part. Thirdly, using weekly average price of ETS for determining CBAM price certificates, could this meet the threshold of equivalent? Now, these are significantly complex determinations. Firstly, on the question of internal tax, the standard is defined in the article itself as imposed consistently with the provisions of Article 3.2. However, is EU ETS qualifiable as a tax? I mean, there are allowances which are being bought. So, this is an interesting determination that eventually we can expect the panels to do if it's adjudicated upon. Secondly, keeping at bay the lack of consensus amongst GATT contracting parties or even the works of Working Party on Border Tax Adjustments and the US Superfund dispute, the current position is that there is no clarity on whether or not embedded carbon being taxed on imports could fall within the ambit of an article from which the imported product has been manufactured or produced. On the third question, assuming that the EU ETS is the relevant internal tax, and either in terms of likeness or in terms of article from which imported product has been manufactured or produced, the requisite thresholds have been met. The test of equivalence of charge versus internal tax will be a critical issue. Here, which definition of equivalent is the EU trying to hit at, or whether or not the same justifies the threshold sought under this article, would be another level of assessment that could be checked out. Further, without delving much into detail, with the cumbersome reporting requirements imbibed on the importers, which could be expected to fall on the shoulders of exporters or producers, where it is required to report direct and indirect emissions, at least in the transitional phase, potential claims under Article 11 could also be raised. Now, coming to potential justifications that EU could raise and assessing whether or not there are limitations to such a thought. At the outset, it's important to note that Article 20 of GATT lists out the general exceptions. These general exceptions can be relied upon to justify breaches from other articles of GATT. There are 10 rationales listed out in paragraphs A to J of Article 20, out of which paragraph G relates to conservation of exhaustible natural resources. The legal standard under Article 20 as such is very high, and in almost all cases, parties have not sufficiently provided, the rationales, and as such have failed to meet the threshold. So if the EU was to place reliance on it, it would have to at two levels demonstrate that it meets the requirements. Firstly, of the language of the paragraph claimed, secondly, of the chapeau of Article 20. On examining the language of the paragraph, question is, which exhaustible natural resource is being conserved? Is it air? In terms of the objective listed by EU of addressing carbon leakage, how well does it correspond to conservation of air in case that is sought to be conserved? Many gaps appear. Is air exhaustible? Is addressing carbon leakage going to support conservation of air? Trade scholars have opined that citing carbon leakage, EU talks about risks rather than certainty. Studies, for instance, by UNCTAD have suggested that CBAM would reduce CO2 emissions by just 0.1%. So, to what extent does it really meet the objective? Another study by Boston University notes that CBAM could worsen income inequality and welfare distribution between rich and poor economies. So, what about the ancillary impact of CBAM? Secondly, coming to the chapeau, the questions get even more complicated in attempting to justify it. Is the measure applied in a manner that would constitute a means of arbitrary or unjustifiable discrimination? Is it a disguised restriction on international trade? Could the challenging party, in case it's challenged, present an alternative that meets the same objective but is less trade distortive? The way CBAM works is such that it requires even those countries which have an ETS system in place to pay according to EU's decarbonization goals, that is, according to the EU ETS price. This is despite differentiated commitment levels under international environmental law. Now, subjecting countries with differentiated emission reduction commitment levels to the same treatment, could this be classified as arbitrary or unjustifiable discrimination? Question worth wondering about, I believe. However, it's also important to note that the appellate body has opined that the given discrimination must be linked with the objective of the measure and must not go against that objective. So, for those paying the price difference from the EU ETS price, they could potentially argue that CBAM defeats the objective. This is so because when the other country has its own ETS regime in place, it's already meeting the objective. So the difference in price being paid to EU does not stand justified anymore. Hence, there could be a potential for the requirements of Article 20 not being met with the way CBAM is operationalized. Now, this slide shows the results of a study sorry, by Hannah Ritchie in 2019, where historical emissions are demonstrated. To give a picture to our examination, if EU CBAM was to be looked at with 22% historical emissions of EU across 1751 to 2017, vis-a-vis, say, Indonesia's emissions at 0.8%, Could EU's ETS price being extended to Indonesia be justified? Potentially unlikely. From this chart, it appears that to effectively address emissions, perhaps per capita emission based policies could be one way to think about it, especially to target the larger chunk of historical emissions by developed countries. Secondly,
Stuti, sorry, Stuti,
no,
the slides aren't loading
ah,
correctly. Would you try it again and see if we can get it to work?
sure. I don't
There
know
we
if you're
go. There we go. Yeah. It works now. It works now. It works now.
okay. Great.
Perfect.
Thanks
Got it.
for
Thank you.
thank you. So coming back to what could be the potential solutions to address the, you know, gap between historical emissions, as I was talking about, firstly, one idea could be that per capita emission-based policies could be thought around, or there could be other ways designed to factor in variables that capture historical emissions in the overall tax computation potentially. However, the current design of CBAM blatantly disregards historical emissions. So essentially, by extending its own decarbonization goals on other countries, EU's CBAM falls short on the requirements that could have justified it under the thresholds of Article 20. Moving further on developing country implications, EU CBAM risks unfairly penalizing the exports of developing countries, is how it's clearly evident, be it in terms of the increased burden on on the exporters from around the world, excluding EU, or be it in terms of the eventual levy that will come into picture starting 2026. Now, concerns about the impact of CBAM have already been raised in the WTO Market Access Committee as well. It appears that deliberations in the Committee on Trade and Environment are also covering CBAM related concerns. In a communication from China recently, dedicated multilateral discussions on border carbon adjustments have been separately sought as well. Many concerns have been highlighted to be deliberated upon, including use of revenue from border carbon adjustments, comparison vis-a-vis NDCs, carbon prices under BCAs, etc. A study by Center for European Reform opines that it is unreasonable to expect poorer countries to shoulder the same burden as those that are richer and have historically contributed to a larger share of carbon emissions. CBAM falls short of taking special consideration of developing countries or even, for that fact, least developed countries. Overall, not only is the cost increased for those wanting to access the EU market, additional cumbersome requirements are also imposed. Now, essentially, the bottom line, the way I see it is, why do the initial rungs of the ladder, that, the ladder of development, why do they have to be dirty when those on the top can afford to clean them? So the CBAM fund being utilized the way it's currently structured, if it could be dedicated towards green financing, technology transfer, capacity building, then the actual utilization of it in the right direction could be anticipated. However, the way it's structured now, it's going to EU's pocket. So the design, I believe, falls short on many of these terms. With that, I pass the floor back to Hannah. Thank you.
Thanks, Stuti. That was really great. I think it's given a nice overview of the legal and institutional issues, as well as some of the development issues around CBAM. So we're going to be getting into that more as we go on. Just for people watching, there was an issue with the slides there, but don't worry, it'll all be posted with the agreement of our panelists on tprforum.org. So you can have a look at the slides, and if you wish, of course, go back to this on the recording at a later point. So let me hand over now to Amar Breckenridge, who's going to give us more of an economic point of view. Floor's yours, Amar.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Hannah. And thank you, Stuti. And it's a pleasure to join you all this afternoon or morning or evening, depending on where you are. So my name is Amar Breckenridge. I work with Frontier Economics. And I'd like quickly to talk through some of the economic aspects of the CBAM. It'll be a high-level presentation, and I'll try and condense it so we have some time for discussion afterwards. I'll just do that with some trepidation, that step of sharing my screen. So you can all see this. Is the screen visible to everyone? Yeah. Someone could confirm.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
it's all good. Okay. All right. I'm getting some messages that Zoom has crashed out on me. Can you still see me?
No, you're good. You're good.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
So just to back up and set the problem at a high level. So remember that what we're trying to solve with climate change is a global collective action problem of stabilizing atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases within a safe limit. Like all collective action problems, it requires a treaty. The main concern on the climate front is the fact that it allows for differentiated commitments and that there's no binding enforcement commitment, a mechanism to enforce these commitments. And I guess the combination of the two has led to fears in some jurisdictions, such as the European Union, that asymmetries in reduction commitments, emissions reduction commitments, would lead to the relocation of activity from more ambitious jurisdictions to less ambitious ones, a fear known as carbon leakage. And that's inefficient because it's a global problem that we're trying to solve. And so if you have relocation of economic activity and emissions stay the same, then you haven't made much progress on that. Now, in practice, the evidence on carbon leakage is patchy and not very certain. So the issue is sometimes reframed as one of competitiveness of emissions-intensive industries, and that's more of a political economy problem. And I just want you to keep that in mind because these are issues we'll return to a bit later on in our discussion. But for the moment, the key problem that we're trying to solve through the CBAM is the following. For a jurisdiction that has more stringent emissions reduction targets, the idea is to ensure that differentials in commitments don't alter the patterns of competition for its goods in home and foreign markets. That's the overall problem that we're trying to solve. Now, as you're aware, there are many different ways of dealing with this problem. And historically, the way the EU and others have dealt with it is through the free allocation of permits tied to production, an approach called, sometimes referred to as shielding. And this is analytically equivalent to a production subsidy tied to emissions intensity. Its main advantage is that it's relatively straightforward to implement administratively. Its disadvantage is that it's less efficient economically and from an environmental perspective. The allocation of such permits is also comes within the scope of WTO SCM rules. So the US, for example, imposed countervailing duties on EU free allocation of permits for certain steel exports. Now, the border tax adjustment approach draws by analogy on the approach that's used in the case of indirect taxes such as VAT. But in the case of emissions pricing, we're not looking at a tax on consumption, which is the case with indirect taxes such as VAT. We're looking at a tax on embodied emissions. And that creates more of a challenge, as we shall see. Now, the way the border tax adjustment should work is there should be an import leg, so where you're trying to impose the domestic emission price on the emissions content of the foreign produced good. And there's an export leg, which is where you rebate the domestic emissions price on the locally produced good at the point of export to the partner. At the moment, the EU CBAM has only really defined the import leg, and so most of my presentation will be focused on that. The export leg is yet to be determined, I think mainly because of concerns that arose from the experience of shielding in how you structure the export leg to be compliant with WTO rules and subsidies. Now, why would you have a border tax adjustment rather than a shielding approach? Mainly because from an economic point of view, it's more efficient. It helps you to reduce emissions compared to a shielding approach, and it also helps you to raise revenues that then can be used for other purposes. And it helps to preserve abatement incentives across the economy as a whole, whereas if you're shielding a few sectors, then the overall emissions reduction tasks falls more heavily on non-shielded sectors, and that can create distortions within an economy. It's also, I think, fairly clear from the EU's approach that they hope that the carbon border adjustment mechanisms will create incentives for partners to implement emissions pricing. The main challenge is the admin burden in a border tax adjustment mechanism context is much higher than a shielding approach. And I think that's a lot of what Stuti touched on really turns around the issue of how you identify and quantify the appropriate level of emissions that should be taxed on imports coming in and avoid unduly charging them. Now, a bit of CBAM arithmetic. So as we said, the CBAM is a charge on emissions. And so what we're trying to do is actually compensate for the difference between the emissions price charged at home and those in the trading partner. So we've talked about the EU CBAM. The UK is also looking to implement one. So if you're the EU or the UK, you take the local emissions price, you work out the difference between the partner price, and then you levy it on the tons of embodied carbon dioxide equivalents in the traded good. And under current CBAM regulations, the emissions that come within the scope of the CBAM are the direct emissions that are emitted as part of the production process, and some indirect emissions, including electricity and material inputs into the production of a good. Some other indirect emissions are excluded. But in sum, the larger the differential between the home, that is the EU or the UK carbon price, and the partner trading price, emissions trading price, the lead.
Oh no, Amar froze. Was that just for me? Maybe I'm the one who
No,
froze.
froze for me as well. So we'll just have to give
okay.
him a second. I know he was having some Zoom problems, but we'll give him a second to come back on. And if he drops, we'll just go to Q&A in a moment. So please bear with us for a couple of minutes.
Yeah, the tech is not working with us today, Ben. Sometimes
No,
it's like
it
that.
normally goes so efficiently, and today we've just had bad luck.
I know, or usually we have very good luck, and today we have normal luck. Yes, Yaroslav, we just saw that too, that we lost our speaker, and he'll probably be, we were joking about this before, and Ben said, well, in that case, if that happens, Hannah will sing a song or dance something. And I don't really have anything signed ready to go. So I'm gonna instead lean on all the amazing people in our audience today. Please start posting your Q&A. No, your Q's to the A's. There you go. Amar,
Okay,
Sorry,
Amar's back.
not sure what happened. It all crashed at one point. I don't know if it's
no worries.
let me share the screen again. I've noticed that in sharing that there are some issues, so hopefully it won't
you were
happen
doing
again.
fine though, even though it said that you were crashing. You weren't until later.
Okay,
but
good. I'm back. So hopefully everyone can hear me, and we're back.
We can't
Can
see
you
the
see?
slides, however.
No,
Okay.
they're saying launch meetings instead.
We're seeing your browser window, not your slides.
And it's telling me it's crashed again. So
you are good though. We hear you well, and we see your screen. We just don't see the right thing. There we go.
There we go.
You're good.
Now we
You're
see
good. Yeah.
the slides. Perfect.
okay.
Amar, you're good to go.
Mm-hmm. It's for some reason the share is causing.
So if the share's not working, maybe just go ahead verbally, and we
Yeah.
can post the slides on the website and people can catch up with that
Sure.
at a later point, because
Yeah.
it
Okay.
seems like the tech is having a bad day today.
Yeah. Okay. You can see me. Can you see anything looking like
Yes.
slides on the... Okay, good.
Yeah.
All right. I think I might have to keep it in this reduce mode, because every time I maximize the screen, it crashes out. But anyway, so as I was saying, the CBAM, oh dear.
No, it works. And then you can just magnify it on the screen. So it works.
Yeah. Yeah. The CBAM increases as a result of the degree of embodied carbon and the differential between domestic and foreign carbon price.
No, 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 no. No, no, no.
Okay, look, I'm going to stop sharing, because that clearly is antagonizing Zoom beyond any reasonable level of response. So, so what the slide was showing is essentially how to calculate the CBAM charge. Now you can convert the CBAM charge into an ad valorem equivalent, which is the key step that you would do when you're trying to work out its trade effects. And you do that by working out the CBAM charge and dividing it by the value of imports. And so in that sense, the CBAM can be worked out to an ad valorem equivalent. We have a standard name for an ad valorem equivalent, and in this case, it's called a tariff. Except that the CBAM is a very particular type of tariff, in that it will vary not only by country, but it will vary by type of product, and it'll also vary over time with the differential between EU carbon prices and the carbon price in the country of origin. So there will be a fair degree of volatility in the CBAM with respect to any particular good and trading partner over time. Now, a key issue is this. Remember that the original idea was to correct for carbon leakage. But actually what the CBAM does is something a lot more specific. It corrects for differences in carbon pricing, which is a different thing. And the reason it's different is this, is that you can have reduction commitments that don't involve using a carbon price. Okay, so overall carbon leakage concerns arise because countries like the EU or jurisdictions like the EU or Japan, for example, are worried that they are having ambitious reduction commitments, and there are other jurisdictions that, under the principle of common and differentiated responsibility, have less ambitious reduction commitments. That's the source of the concerns about carbon leakage. But here we're looking at differences in emissions pricing, which, as I said, is a narrow concept, and the reason is you can pursue ambitious carbon reduction commitments with no emissions pricing. So the US, for example, has carbon reduction commitments, but it has no emissions price, right? And that's true for political reasons. You can follow these reduction commitments by using large-scale subsidies, such as in the Inflation Reduction Act, and through regulation. And the reason this is important is that the structure of costs will be very different on the domestic economy, depending on whether you're using emissions pricing or using some other methodology. So, for example, if you take the case of steel, if you're using a carbon emissions price, that will raise the cost of producing steel, and it'll incentivize switching to low carbon steel production, but it'll raise the cost of producing steel. On the other hand, you can grant subsidies to steel producers to switch technologies, which will also create incentives to switch to greener technologies, but it will reduce their costs and therefore have a dampening effects on their prices. So for two jurisdictions, one with the steel industry subject to a carbon price, another steel industry subject to large-scale subsidies, the latter will be more competitive, okay? Now, the question is, well, then why don't we all just subsidize merrily as we want to? The reason is that carbon pricing actually is a more efficient way on an economy-wide basis to pursue abatement. It involves pricing an externality, which is the direct cause of the problem, and it sends signals across the economy as a whole, whereas a subsidy-based approach is a more command and control method, and it's specific to particular industries. It also needs to be financed through general taxation or by cutting expenditure elsewhere, which is economically less efficient than using a carbon price. And the carbon price taxes an externality directly and allows you to raise money from that, which then can be used for other purposes. So that's why jurisdictions like the EU would prefer to stick to emissions pricing, but they are worried about the very specific effects it has on certain sectors like steel, cement, aluminium, and so forth, which are exposed to emissions pricing in a world where not everyone has emissions pricing, and also have broader geopolitical and strategic concerns. Let's be clear about that. So it's what we're seeing here is that the CBAM is as much a response to a broader problem about, as much as it is a response to broader problems about carbon leakage, it's actually very heavily a political economy instrument that is there to manage some very specific concerns about industries that are exposed to the effects of introducing carbon pricing. And I think that's an important point to bear in mind because it speaks to the wider issue of what the purpose of carbon pricing of the CBAM is. And now, very quickly, before running through some of the modeling that we've done around the CBAM, this is the point at which trade policy meets what I call emissions policy 101. And remember here, we've talked a lot about emissions pricing, but the EU has a very specific approach to emissions pricing, which is a cap and trade mechanism. It's possible to follow an alternative mechanism, which is just to specify a flat emissions price that then holds over a period of time. But the EU has followed an approach whereby it limits the quantity of emissions and allows the price of emissions to vary. What this in practice leads to is a fair degree of volatility in the emissions price, and by extension, volatility in the CBAM. And that has potential important consequences on trade, because I said you can work out for a given CBAM value its ad valorem equivalent, which acts as a tariff. But now what you have with an underlying volatility in emissions pricing is a volatile tariff, okay? So that can reduce the stability and predictability of market access, which is one of the key benefits of having a rule-based multilateral trading system, right? So when I was a young professional working at the WTO, whenever we went out to talk about the benefits of the WTO, the first thing you say is stable and predictable market access. Well, here you have a mechanism that might undermine that. It also means that partners will be exposed to shocks that the EU faces that can cause volatility in the underlying CBAM. So, for example, energy price shocks create significant volatility in the EU's emissions price, and that can then flow through to the CBAM. Similarly, faster than expected economic growth, as an aggregate demand shock in the EU, can also increase the underlying emissions price and transmit that shock via the CBAM then into other economies. So that's an important thing to bear in mind. In modeling the effects of the CBAM, there are various ways of doing this. One way of doing it is to come up with projections about the underlying emissions price and to measure the embodied emissions intensity of the goods that are traded between the EU and its trading partners. And
Amar, I'm just going to jump in here for a second and let you know that we only have 10 minutes left of the whole webinar. There's quick Q&A too.
Yeah, I'll wrap up in 2 minutes then.
Thank you.
And what we've seen in our modeling is that the the overall economic effects of the CBAM, by and large, are relatively limited. On the EU, the CBAM acts as a tax on its own exports, paradoxically, but this is the standard result in trade, which is that an import tariff acts as a tax on exports. The main transmission mechanism for the CBAM's economic effects are through the terms of trade. The CBAM worsens the terms of trade for its trading partners, but at the same time, these trading partners see a depreciation in their real exchange rates, which means that the negative effect of the CBAM on their exports is partly offset by a real exchange rate depreciation, which causes an increase in their exports to the EU that are not affected by the CBAM. What our work has shown is that while overall these effects are relatively moderate, the biggest effects fall on economies in sub-Saharan Africa. Why? Mainly because the CBAM and real exchange rate depreciations increase the cost of capital in sub-Saharan Africa, and that penalizes growth, particularly in economies that are very labor intensive. So just to wrap up, in terms of a policy discussion, the CBAM is really a political economy instrument that's operating in a second-best environment. Okay, it's trying to correct for the very specific effects of differentials in carbon prices across jurisdictions and the particular impacts these have on sectors, and the transmission mechanisms that then translate these impacts into its partners out through terms of trade effects and through the volatility that the CBAM might have as a result of volatility in underlying emissions prices. It does highlight the importance of continued multilateral cooperation and particularly multilateral surveillance. As I said, the CBAM, as I like to say, the CBAM is a new beast in an already complex trade ecosystem and is worth observing closely.
Okay, thank you so much, Amar. So we've got two really interesting perspectives, and we've got just a little bit of time for Q&A. So I'm going to give, I think, one question to each speaker, a related question. Stuti, let me start with you. Now, I'm an economist, but I got my start in trade as a lawyer way back an embarrassingly long time ago. And what I remember learning at the time was that, when the dispute settlement system and the appellate body looked at environmental measures, they tended to say, yes, we've got this exception in the GATT for protection of natural resources, and we'd really like to uphold the measure that you've put in place, but there's a better measure that you could have adopted that would have been less distortionary, and therefore we're going to find against you. And of course, they did that in some of these famous ongoing long-running cases. Do you think that CBAM falls into that territory, that it's a good thing to do, but it needs to be done in a better way?
That's an excellent question, Ben. And I think our perspectives slightly align, because I feel, yes, it's one of those measures that, has a great thought underpinning it. But at the same time, the design could, have certain adjustments, like I was hinting at as well during the presentation, that could make it a bit more fairer in a way, if I could put it like that, because one important aspect so CBDR, RC for a second, even if we put it aside, however, what we can't put aside, in my limited understanding, is the historical emissions. So if there is a way to factor the historical emissions in that, then the way the mechanism would operate, I believe then all the checklist boxes would be ticked off.
Yep, that makes a lot of sense. Let me flip it over to Amar. I'm going to ask the question in a slightly different way. I think you and I are both big fans of Max Corden, who, of course, is a famous trade economist who wrote about the way in which we can rank trade policies, whether they're first best, second best, all this sort of thing. So, you compared a couple of different policy approaches, shielding versus border adjustment, for instance. Where do you think CBAM sits in the hierarchy of policies? Is it something that we could design a little bit better from an efficiency of emission reduction perspective? And one kind of just a little bullet that I want to put under the question is something that's come up in Q&A about trade deflection. So, of course, what a CBAM in the EU or the UK does is reduce imports from jurisdictions without a carbon price into that market. But they're then going to export more to other markets, to third markets. So that dampens, and I think is part of the reason that, when you talk about aggregate results, they are sort of in the small to moderate range. They're not as disastrous as one might think. Is that a concern for the design of the measure, that it allows for these sorts of effects?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a valid point in that when you would impose, if you impose the CBAM, you would see some diversion of trade away from the EU to other markets. And I suppose we are in a second best world by virtue of the fact that there's no global carbon price, right?
Right.
That's what you need. So all this comes from that initial problem. And I understand that, the various constraints on having a global carbon price, but we are in a second best world because of that. And so now we're comparing alternatives of managing that. One is, well, why worry about carbon leakage and not do anything? That isn't working mainly because of this issue of competitiveness, which is more a political economy concern. And it is particularly a political economy concern because of the distributional impacts of emissions pricing, which is the chosen delivery mechanism for abatement commitments in the EU. I think in terms of improving, so if we go on the basis that it's better for everyone that the EU pursues a high level of abatement commitments and have a CBAM than have lower abatement commitments and no CBAM, the question is, what can we do to get the CBAM to work better, or what can we do to mitigate some of its effects? Well, one of the transmission mechanisms, as I said, is the effect on trade costs. So you can find ways of reducing trade costs through other policy measures for developing countries, and that includes trade costs that developing countries generate themselves through their own tariffs and through shortfalls in trade facilitation and so forth. So I think it does raise the issue coming back to Max Gordon, it does raise sort of the need for thinking through a broader range of policy instruments to deal with some of the broader spillover effects of the CBAM itself. I think there's also a case for understanding how to manage some of the volatility of the CBAM that would come through the volatility of the emissions price that underlies it, and thinking whether there's any way of smoothing that out.
Let me maybe wrap up on those couple of points. I think we've had a really interesting discussion. We're getting very close to time, so let me finish off with a couple of thoughts. One is this point that was made, I think, in both presentations, that the absence of an emissions price is not the same thing as doing nothing about CO2 abatement. There are lots of mechanisms that countries are using. It came up, the US-style subsidies approach came up in the presentations. In the Q&A, people were talking about reforestation and all of these other sorts of methods that are being used elsewhere. So that's going to be an interesting thing that we're all going to have on our radar, both as economists and as lawyers. What does it mean that one instrument has been selected and given this kind of primacy? Then the second one, I really want to stress this uncertainty aspect. It's a funny coincidence that over the last few years, there's been some excellent work demonstrating quantitatively for the first time that the certainty of trade policy is actually a really important factor in generating bilateral trade. So now that we have this measure that is going to fluctuate with the price, and as Amar said, it's a quantity control mechanism, which means that all of the adjustment goes through price. What does that do to all of that sort of work? Are we going to see trade disruptions through the uncertainty channel as well? And then from the legal perspective, what does that do to our ranking of policies? Is this the right way to go about doing something good? So we're in the early days of this. I think it's been really valuable, Stuti. We really appreciate the way that you've walked us through the different aspects of the mechanism and all of the legal issues that come up. Amar, we really appreciate that you've shared some of your modelling results with us and talked through some of the economic mechanisms. So I learned a ton from that session. I know it's something that I'm going to be working with and spending a lot more time with over the coming years. So thank you to both of our panelists for their great participation. Let me do a quick bit of publicity for our next session, which is on February 22nd, where we're going to be talking about fisheries and in particular, multidimensional policies and multidisciplinary problem solving. So it's going to be a really fun session with Christine McDaniel and Sarah Stewart. If you'd like to stay tuned with us, please sign up for our mailing list. You can see the recording and have a look at the PowerPoints on our website, tprforum.org. Please join our LinkedIn group, and we look forward to all staying in touch on this very important issue and the full range of trade policy issues. So thanks very much, everyone, for being with us today.
Thank you so much,
Amar
and Stuti, and thank you, Ben, for organizing this super interesting webinar. We're so spoiled to get to do this, right? We get to invite the coolest people we know to talk about their research. And people, you who are now worried about the tech issues that we had today, don't worry about it because it's all recorded. It's all going to be on the website and all the presentations are going to be there too. So no problem. You'll be catching up in no time. So we'll see you all next month. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.